The water has already climbed past the front axle of the tractor when Tom finally cuts the engine. It isn't just any tractor. This is the John Deere, a $60,000 machine complete with a GPS antenna, a command center display, and the dealer stickers still clinging to the door pillar. The engine is warm and the lights are cutting through the dark, but the fault codes are blinking and the wheels won't turn. 30 yards back, two grain trailers are sitting in a field that is rapidly turning into soup. That represents $80,000 of harvest that needs to be somewhere else, and the forecast says this rain isn't going to let up until morning. So you have to ask yourself a hard question. What do you do when the machine you are still paying for refuses to work because its own software told it no? Tom runs a farm that isn't particularly large by modern standards, covering about 400 acres of mixed grain in the kind of country where fields slope toward each other and water finds the low spots fast. It is the sort of operation where one bad year does more than just hurt your bank account. A loss like that follows you into the spring and dictates every equipment decision you make for the next 3 seasons because there is no buffer thick enough to make a lost harvest just disappear. The season had been a good one, which only made the coming disaster feel worse. Yields were tracking well above the average, and the storage bins were nearly full to the top. 2 trailer loads of wheat, which had been harvested late and stayed dry, were still parked out in the east field, while Tom waited for a weather window to move them up to the yard. It wasn't a crisis yet, but rather just one more item on a long list of things to do. That John Deere had been on the farm for 3 years by that point. It arrived on a financing arrangement that stretched the payments out just long enough to feel manageable, at least until they didn't. The machine was fully loaded with a precision ag package and auto steer, along with every sensor and safety system the dealer's sales rep could talk about during the handover. Tom remembered that the man used the phrase "pays for itself" twice during that meeting, and he remembered exactly how it sounded. Meanwhile, the Massey Ferguson 865 lived at the back of the equipment shed behind the grain auger and a stack of old tire weights. Tom bought it used about 30 years ago from a neighbor who was retiring and needed the space cleared out. He paid cash for it, and it wasn't even that much cash before driving it home that same afternoon. It needed a fuel injector that first winter and a water pump a few years later, but every repair happened right there in the shed. Tom did the work himself with parts from a supplier who had been stocking Perkins components since before he started farming. The real contrast between these two machines isn't about how old they are or even about technology in a general sense. It is a question of who actually owns what. The John Deere came with a software license agreement buried deep in the financing paperwork, and that document determines who gets to read the diagnostic codes when something goes wrong. The Massey doesn't have a software license, because it doesn't have software. So if something breaks, Tom finds the part and replaces it. That difference usually felt like something that didn't matter much in the real world. On a dry day in June, with the auto steer threading rows and the yield monitor logging data in real time, the John Deere was everything the dealer promised it would be. Then the rain started falling. It wasn't a steady overnight rain, but a system that moved in from the northwest much faster than the forecast predicted. It dropped 1.5 inches in about 2 hours, sending water sheeting off the hillside and straight for the low corner where the trailers were parked. Tom watched it from his kitchen window at 10:30 and understood exactly what was about to happen. He pulled on his boots and went out anyway, doing the thing farmers do when the only other choice is standing at a window watching something bad happen. The east field usually drains toward the low corner during a normal rain, but this wasn't a normal rain by any stretch of the imagination. Instead of soaking into the dirt, the water coming off the hillside was running across the surface in heavy sheets that carried the topsoil with it. It was pooling fast in the depression where the 2 trailers sat, a spot Tom had picked because it was flat and firm and out of the way. Back in August, that corner was always the last place to dry out after a quick shower. but at 10:30 on an October night with nearly 2 inches down and more coming, it was turning into a pond. His first instinct was the right one, which was to get the John Deere out and hook a chain to the first trailer so he could pull them both up to the yard before the ground got too soft to move on. The trailers weren't even heavy, since the grain had already been moved into the bins, leaving nothing but the empty steel frames sitting out there in the dark. In dry conditions, moving them would have been a 5-minute job for each one, and even in light mud, he figured it would take 15 minutes total. He had done it plenty of times before without a single problem. The Deere started up without any complaint, and for a moment it seemed like that part of the plan was going to work just fine. With the lights on and the engine warming up, the command center display glowed a soft amber color inside the cab as he steered toward the field. He drove the machine down the track toward the east side and felt the rear wheels settle a little deeper as he left the gravel, but he kept his foot on the gas. The front axle dropped into the saturated ground and the tires spun once, then twice. And that was when the slip control system kicked in. He felt the change before he ever saw it on the screen, because the power just seemed to leave the machine all at once. It wasn't a gradual slowdown, but a hard cut where the engine kept running while the torque going to the wheels dropped to almost nothing. The system was pulling back because the sensors read the wheel spin as a problem to be stopped rather than a hurdle to push through. He tried to give it gas one more time, but the result was exactly the same, leaving the tractor sitting there idling in the mud and going nowhere. Then the display started talking to him with 3 different fault codes that stacked up one after another on the screen. He half recognized the first 2 as having something to do with traction management, which are the kind of alerts that usually clear themselves after you restart the engine. The third one was a total mystery that he didn't recognize at all, and it had a little padlock icon next to it that he had never seen in all his years of farming. He shut the engine off and turned it back on, which cleared the first 2 codes, but that third one with the padlock stayed right where it was. By that time, the water in the low corner of the field had risen past the wheel hubs on the trailers. He kept the physical manual in the cab instead of relying on the app version, so he grabbed it and flipped to the fault code index in the back to see what he was dealing with. The code wasn't even listed in the book, which isn't unusual with these newer machines because the software updates much faster than the printed paper can keep up with. Some of these codes only exist inside the dealer's own diagnostic system, and that meant at 11 o'clock on a wet Tuesday, Tom was looking at a locked machine in a field that was filling with water. The nearest dealer was 40 miles away and wouldn't be open for hours. He called the dealer's after-hours line anyway and left a message, then sat in the cab for another 2 minutes just watching the rain come down while the trailers sat 30 yards away. The water was still rising, and there was nothing left for him to do in the seat of a tractor that refused to pull. He finally climbed out, walked back through the mud to the yard, and headed toward the equipment shed to find another way. The John Deere stayed exactly where it was with the engine off but the lights still burning, slowly running down the battery in the middle of the dark field. To understand why that tractor locked up, you have to look at what is actually running inside the computer. Because the answer isn't just one simple glitch. It is actually 3 different things happening at the exact same time, where every system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, yet every single one of them was wrong for the situation Tom was facing. It starts with the obstacle sensors, which are the ultrasonic and radar arrays that modern tractors use to find things the driver might miss. On a clear day when you're working in a clean field, these sensors work great. But in a driving rainstorm, the sensor faces get coated with mud in less than a minute. The computer isn't smart enough to tell the difference between a layer of mud on a sensor and a real object sitting in front of the machine. Because it can't tell the difference, it flags both as a danger, so the display was reading a critical obstacle when the reality was just an open field with 2 trailers 30 yards away. The sensors were blind, so the system defaulted to a full stop. That is only the first layer of the problem. The second layer is the slip control algorithm, which is a program that watches how fast the wheels are turning compared to how fast the tractor is actually moving. When that difference gets too high, the computer starts cutting the power to the drive wheels to prevent them from spinning. This logic makes sense in most cases because spinning your wheels can damage the drivetrain, dig deep ruts, and waste a lot of fuel for no reason. The software is trying to protect the machine and the soil at the same time. But in liquid mud, that spinning isn't a sign of a broken part. It is just basic physics. The wheels spin because they haven't found anything solid to grab yet, and the right move is to keep pushing until the tires hit the hard ground underneath the mess. The algorithm doesn't know that, so it sees a spin it was programmed to stop, and it kills the torque until the tractor just sits there. Then you have the third layer, which is the one that triggered the padlock icon. Modern diesel engines use something called diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF, which is an additive injected into the exhaust to help lower the amount of pollution coming out of the pipe. The system uses a sensor circuit to check the level and the quality of that fluid. But during a flood or a heavy storm, water can get into that circuit very easily. When that happens, the computer reads the water as a sign that the emissions system is being tampered with, and it triggers a service lockout. This isn't just a warning light or a suggestion to check the tank, but a total shutdown where the engine might run, but the machine won't move under any kind of load. You can't reset this in the field, because it requires a dealer-level tool to read the code and clear the lock. You need a laptop, a specific cable, a trained technician, and the proprietary software that only the dealer owns. At today's prices, that is a $500 phone call just to get someone to drive out and plug in a cord. Tom didn't know which of these three problems had caused that padlock code to pop up, and the truth is, he still doesn't know for sure. That is the real issue hidden underneath all the technology. Because the person who owns the machine isn't allowed to know what is wrong with it. The fault codes on a tractor he is still paying for exist inside a system he isn't allowed to touch. If he wanted basic readings, he could pay $200 a year for a subscription. But the advanced tools that actually clear locks cost nearly $6,000 a year. The machine was doing exactly what the engineers designed it to do, and every single safety system fired off just like it was supposed to. The sensors saw mud, the slip control cut the power, and the DEF circuit locked the transmission to protect the environment. From the perspective of the software, everything was working perfectly. But from Tom's perspective, the machine had simply decided to stop being useful at the worst possible moment. It didn't stop because it was broken, but because the computer decided it shouldn't move. He turned his back on the tractor and walked toward the shed. The shed light flickers on and the Massey sits there exactly how it always sits, tucked into the back corner with a slight lean to the left because of a soft rear tire that Tom tops up every few weeks without worrying much about the leak. Most of the red paint is worn away over the years, leaving bare metal along the hood and fenders that looks like neglect to a stranger. But it's really just the physical record of 3 decades of hard work. One headlight throws a full beam while the other only manages about half strength, a quirk Tom has known about for a long time and never bothered to fix because that half beam still shows him everything he needs to see. He has owned this tractor for 30 years now, which is long enough to know exactly where the clutch catches and how the Perkins engine sounds when it's pulling a heavy load versus when it's just spinning its wheels. He knows the specific throttle position that keeps the engine from hunting at idle when the weather turns cold. And that kind of deep mechanical knowledge isn't something you can find in a manual or a digital display. It lives in his hands and his ears and the way he settles into the seat before he even turns the key. A relationship you just don't get with a machine you've only had for a few seasons on a financing plan. The heart of the machine is a Perkins A 4.236 engine, a 4-cylinder workhorse with 3.3 liters of displacement and a mechanical fuel injection system that doesn't rely on computers. There is no electronic control unit to fail, no emission sensors to trip, and no DEF circuit to get gummed up, meaning there is nothing under the hood that a little bit of water can confuse or shut down. Fuel goes in and air goes in, while the injector pump meters the mixture mechanically. So the engine decides how hard to pull based entirely on how far you push the throttle with your foot. That is the whole system in its entirety, and when the weather turns sour and the ground gets soft, the Perkins doesn't know it's raining, and it certainly doesn't care. Peak torque on this particular engine kicks in well below 1,500 revolutions per minute, which is a detail that matters immensely when you are working in deep mud because mud never rewards speed. It rewards patience and a sustained, heavy load. And when you are trying to drag a dead weight through saturated ground, you want power that is already waiting for you rather than power you have to rev up to find. The Massey delivers that steady grunt without asking for anything in return. And it does it with a mechanical simplicity that modern tractors have largely moved away from in favor of efficiency. The transmission is the other half of the equation, a system Massey called multi-power that definitely earned its reputation on farms like this one over the last few decades. It allows you to shift between a high and a low range without ever touching the clutch pedal. So when you feel the resistance building and the tire starting to struggle, you just flip the lever to multiply your torque without losing your forward momentum. In a difficult mud pull, that isn't just a nice feature to have, but it is actually the most important tool at your disposal, because stalling in the middle of a pull is a disaster. If the chain is taut and the trailer is just starting to break free, stopping means you have to start over from a dead stop, in ground that is now even worse than when you began. The differential lock is nothing more than a simple foot pedal located on the left side of the floorboards where Tom can reach it easily. When you press that pedal down, steel engages with steel to make both rear wheels turn together, regardless of which one has better traction at the moment. There is no sensor deciding if you have met the right conditions for a lock, and no algorithm weighing the risk of drivetrain stress against your need for grip. You put your foot down to lock the wheels, you pull the load, and when you lift your foot back up, the system unlocks and goes back to normal. Tom doesn't keep this old Massey around just because he's sentimental, though there is probably a bit of that involved after 30 years of sitting in that same seat. He keeps it because there are certain jobs on a farm that go wrong in ways that no software engineer ever designed a response for. And when those moments happen, he needs a machine that will do exactly what he tells it to do without trying to negotiate. Tonight is one of those jobs where the high-tech equipment has reached its limit. So he hooks the heavy tow chain to the drawbar, climbs up into the cab, and fires the old girl up. The Perkins engine catches on the very second crank and settles into a steady idle, and Tom sits there for a moment, just listening to the rhythm the way he always does before a big job. He isn't waiting for a light to change or a computer to boot up, but he's just letting the engine tell him it's ready to work. And it sounds exactly the same at 11 o'clock in a rainstorm as it does on a clear morning in July. That kind of consistency is a comfort when everything else is going wrong, and he puts the tractor in gear and heads out into the dark. He drives down the muddy track with his headlights cutting through the downpour, the weak half beam on the left side doing its best to show him the edge of the path. The John Deere is still sitting out there in the field like a dark ghost, its running lights fading away as the battery finally dies. But Tom drives right past it without stopping to look. The ground is noticeably worse than it was only 20 minutes ago, and he can feel the Massey settling deeper into the soft topsoil through the vibration in his seat as the rear tires hunt for purchase with every yard he moves forward. He reaches the first trailer and drops down off the seat into the mud, hooking the heavy chain to the hitch pin in the pouring rain without rushing his movements. Rushing is usually how you make a bad situation even worse. So he takes his time to make sure the connection is solid before climbing back up into the dry cab. He pushes the diff lock down with his left foot before he even touches the throttle, Then he eases the tractor forward until the chain pulls taut, and he can feel the resistance loading up through the heavy steel drawbar. He drops the multi-power lever into low range, and the engine note changes to a deeper growl as the tires begin to dig into the muck. The Perkins doesn't need to rev up high to meet the load because the torque is already there waiting at 1,400 revolutions per minute, creating the kind of steady pull that doesn't need a lot of noise to get the job done. The rear wheels spin once and find something solid beneath the slop. Then they spin again and find even more grip. But the trailer doesn't actually move for 3 long seconds. Then, with a sudden groan of metal, it finally starts to budge. It moves slowly at first, the kind of slow where you can't really tell if you're making progress or if the tractor is just burying itself deeper into the field. But the chain stays tight, and the ground keeps passing beneath him. And after 10 seconds of steady pressure, there is no question that the trailer is following him out of the hole. Tom holds the throttle perfectly steady and doesn't touch a single other control, choosing instead to just keep the load moving at a constant pace until they reach the edge of the field. It takes about 4 minutes of focused driving to get that first trailer up to the high ground at the edge of the yard where the water can't reach it. He unhooks the chain, turns the Massey around, and heads back down into the low ground for the second one, knowing the field is going to be even worse on this pass. The ruts he left behind on the first run are already filling up with rainwater, and the surface has become so slick that the front wheels are starting to push sideways instead of tracking straight. The rain is coming down even heavier now, drumming against the cab roof loud enough to compete with the engine, and he can see that the water in the low corner has risen enough to submerge the trailer axles. He hooks up the second trailer faster this time because the ground under his boots is so soft that each footprint fills with water before he can even take his next step. Once he's back in the seat, he gets the diff lock down and the chain taut, but this second pull is much harder from the very start. The trailer has been sitting in the saturated earth long enough that the tires have settled deep into the mud, and breaking that suction seal takes a lot more power than the first one did. The Massey begins to bog down, the engine note dropping into a low and rough struggle that makes the whole machine shudder under the massive weight. Tom drops the transmission even further into the low range and holds the throttle exactly where it is, refusing to back off or panic as the engine fights to stay alive. The tractor bogs a second time about 30 seconds into the pull, and he feels the rear end start to walk sideways as the left wheel digs deeper than the right one. He steers into the slide and holds his foot steady, waiting for the machine to find its footing, and eventually the tires find something solid to grab onto. The shuddering smooths out, and the trailer starts to crawl forward again, slowly leaving the rising water behind. He finally gets the second load to the high ground with only a couple of minutes to spare before the floodwater reaches the spot where the trailer had been parked. From the safety of the yard, he can see the dark edge of the water creeping across the low corner of the field, moving with a steady indifference that would have swallowed those trailers whole. The John Deere is still out there in the dark with its lights almost gone and its computer still faulted, but the old Massey has done exactly what it was built to do. Tom unhooks the chain, coils it over the drawbar, and drives the tractor back to the shed to wait for the next time things go wrong. Dawn comes gray and still, the rain gone but the evidence of it everywhere, with standing water in the low corner of the east field catching the flat morning light. The tractor tracks from the night before remain pressed into the field margin, like a record of something that nearly went the other way. And Tom walks out before breakfast to see what the night left behind. He does this most mornings, making a circuit of the yard and the field edges, and even though he already knows what he will find today, he walks out anyway. The low corner is under 18 inches of water. You can see where the high water mark hit on the fence post at the field boundary, leaving a dark stain about knee height that serves as a clean line between last night and this morning. Both trailer spots are gone. They aren't just flooded a little, they are submerged completely, the ground underneath invisible, and the whole depression is turned into something that looks less like a field than like a pond that has been there for years. If the trailers had still been sitting there, they would not have floated. They would have been pushed sideways by the current coming off the hill, filled with water, and buried in the silt when the flood receded. Which means the grain would have been a total write-off. This wouldn't have been a case of damaged or discounted grain. The crop would have been gone, and the insurance company would have spent months arguing about the payout. The John Deere is still out at the edge of the field where Tom left it, listing slightly to the right where one wheel sank deeper into the soft ground during the night. A neighbor comes over mid-morning with a front-end loader, and they pull it out without any drama, a process that takes about 20 minutes and costs Tom nothing more than a future favor. The tractor itself is undamaged, with no water in the engine and no structural problems, but it simply needed to come out of the mud on someone else's terms. The dealer sends a technician out 2 days later. He connects a laptop to the diagnostic port, runs through the fault log, and clears the codes in about 40 minutes, eventually finding that there was no mechanical damage at all. The DEF sensor circuit had flagged a moisture condition, the slip control had stacked a traction fault on top of that, and the combination had tripped the system into a locked state. All 3 codes are gone now, and the tractor is, in the technician's words, fine. Tom gets the invoice at the end of the week. The service call, the mileage, and the diagnostic fee add up to just over $500 to be told his tractor is fine and to have someone clear codes he was not allowed to clear himself. The grain in the 2 trailers stayed dry and undamaged on high ground, and when it sells later that week at market price, the season survives. It does not survive comfortably, especially with the service bill sitting on the kitchen table next to the fuel receipts, but it survives nonetheless. The Massey used maybe 30 liters of diesel across both pulls, and when you add in Tom's mourning and the top-up for the rear tire that went flat from the cold, that is the full cost of the rescue. He put the Massey back in the shed with the mud still on the axles because he did not see any reason to wash it down. Tom's story is not unusual, and that is the part worth sitting with for a moment. Farmers across the Midwest and the UK have been telling versions of this same story for the better part of a decade, involving different fields and different machines, but always leading to the same outcome. A piece of equipment locks up at the worst possible moment. The farmer cannot clear the error himself, and the gap between what the machine can do and what the farmer is allowed to make it do costs him something real. Sometimes it is time or money, but other times it is the entire crop. The PIRG report that tracked this, titled Out to Pasture and published by the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, put a hard number to the problem. U.S. farmers lose an estimated $3 billion every year to tractor downtime. And this is not downtime from worn-out parts or poor maintenance. This is downtime tied to restricted diagnostics and software lockouts, which means $3 billion sits in fields that are flooding or drying out while someone waits for a technician who is authorized to connect a cable to a machine the farmer already owns. The John Deere right to repair fight has been playing out publicly since at least 2017, which is when farmers and independent repair shops first started pushing back on what the company's software licensing agreements actually meant in practice. By 2022, the fight had reached the courts, and a class action settlement that year created a $99 million compensation fund for farmers who had been overcharged on repairs since 2018. The settlement came with no admission of wrongdoing, and the fund averaged out to less than $500 per affected farmer, which barely covers a single service call. John Deere also agreed to release diagnostic and reprogramming tools to farmers directly by the end of 2026, but that commitment is still outstanding, and the FTC has an ongoing lawsuit. The $195 per machine annual subscription for the Operations Center Pro service launched in 2025 as a response to that pressure. But while it is a start, it still does not clear a padlock code at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. But here is the thing that does not get said often enough in these conversations. The problem is not that John Deere builds bad tractors. The 2025-era machines are genuinely impressive in the conditions they were designed for, and the auto steer is accurate enough that nobody who has farmed with one would tell you otherwise. The yield monitors are reliable, and the Precision Ag package delivers real efficiency gains across a full season of normal fieldwork, making the machines a marvel of modern engineering. The problem is that the safety systems were designed for the 95% of farming that looks the way the engineering team expected it to look. They planned for dry fields, known obstacles, and predictable conditions. But farming has always been the other 5%, trying to kill you at regular intervals. The flooding comes in faster than the forecast, the frost arrives a week early, or a trailer gets stuck at the bottom of the low field on a Tuesday night in October. Modern tractors are optimized, but the Massey Ferguson 865 was built to survive. Those are not the same goal, and they do not produce the same machine. Tom does not hate the John Deere, and he said as much later on. On any normal day where the sensors can see what is in front of the machine and the ground is not trying to swallow the wheels, it is the better tractor. It has more power, more precision, and more capability in almost every category that shows up on a spec sheet. But the spec sheet simply did not have a line for what happened in that field. People like to frame the right to repair debate as nothing more than nostalgia, as if farmers wanting to fix their own equipment are just stuck in the past and don't understand how modern technology works. That way of looking at things is completely wrong, and what happened in Tom's field is the clearest proof of why. This isn't about some romantic desire to bring back old tractors, but rather it's a question of whether the machine you paid for and are still making payments on actually belongs to you or the company that wrote the software. Those are two very different questions, and only one of them matters when it's 11 o'clock at night and the water is rising in your field. The way they've structured the cost for diagnostics tells you exactly where you stand in the eyes of the manufacturer. You can pay $195 per machine every year for a farmer-level subscription to the Operations Center Pro, which gives you basic readings and active fault codes, but anything deeper requires dealer tools or third-party systems like JALTest. Those hardware kits start around $3,700 and the price only goes up from there, meaning a 5-tractor operation could spend nearly $1,000 a year just to read their own data. Even after paying for that subscription, a dealer service call still costs you at least $500, so the software doesn't actually replace the technician. It just finds a way to charge you twice for the same problem. Engineers use a specific design principle when they build systems for the real world, and they call it fail open versus fail locked. A system that fails open stays usable even if it isn't at full power, while a system that fails locked defaults to a complete stop to protect itself or the manufacturer's liability. Every single safety system Tom ran into that night was designed to fail locked. And while each individual sensor made sense on a drawing board, they combined to create a machine that chose safety over function when function was the only thing that mattered. The Massey doesn't have safety systems in that modern sense because it relies on mechanical limits and an operator who knows exactly where those limits are. That is the entire architecture of the machine. So when the ground turned into a swamp, the tractor didn't make a single decision for itself. Tom was the one who read the conditions and chose the path. And because the machine did exactly what he told it to do, it showed a design philosophy that actually trusts the person sitting in the seat. Vintage iron isn't going to be the right answer for every farm out there, especially since the Massey can't run auto steer or log yield data the way a modern machine can. Those high-tech features matter over the course of a long season, and nobody is telling you to rip the GPS antenna off your combine and go back to guessing. That isn't the point of this story. The real point is the philosophy behind the design. And when you're looking at any new machine with a service contract, there are 3 questions you need to ask yourself. You need to know if you can read your own fault codes without a subscription, if there are mechanical overrides for the main functions, and if the system fails in a way you can work around when things go wrong. The Massey saved the crop because the people who built it assumed the operator knew what they were doing. And that specific assumption is what's missing from the machines we build today. We have plenty of power and precision, but we've lost the trust between the tool and the user. The Massey trusted Tom to make the right call, while the John Deere trusted its own sensors more than it trusted the man who was actually steering it through the mud. That gap between a machine that serves you and a machine that tries to manage you is the heart of the right to repair movement. The Massey is back in the shed now with mud still clinging to the axles, while the John Deere sits clean and serviced, waiting for a dry day when everything works exactly the way the software expects it to. If you have ever worked with a machine that did what you told it to do without putting up an argument, hit the subscribe button, because there is a lot more of this coming.